Let's get started. We're going to talk about design thinking and this other methodology that's really popular in the world right now called the lean startup. I'm going to just sort of try to draw some comparisons and kind of at the detail level. They're quite different. And then at the more at the abstract or the philosophical level, how do these two things compare? And one of the reasons I think this is interesting is that we are here in Silicon Valley at Stanford, and lots of startups are coming out of Stanford, coming out of Berkeley, coming out of the other schools in the area, and also companies kind of fracture and form new startups. And startups, you only hear about the ones that succeed. Most of them fail, and so I think a lot of the work that we've done on innovation and a lot of the work that's come out of the lean startup movement have been, I think, seminal in creating an environment of invention and creativity and sometimes success in the Valley. So let me start with just the principles behind design thinking. It's pretty straightforward. I'm going to argue that design thinking started at Stanford. If you actually look it up in Wikipedia or other references in the world, it's been around for a while. The notions that created the multidisciplinary program in design at Stanford called the product design program really came from a guy named Bob McKim back in the 70s. Bob was my mentor here at Stanford. He was David Kelly's mentor here at Stanford, a really, really big thinker. A guy named Peter Rowe wrote a book called Design Thinking, which kind of took the approach that architects and urban planners use to do their kinds of design and extrapolated it into this thing called design thinking. The guy who ran the program here for many, many years, Ralph Fosti, through the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, was part of this movement. But I think David Kelly, who I have quoted here, we believe the next generation of innovators and leaders need to be great design thinkers, is really the father of this notion as a coherent set of processes and mindsets, ways of approaching innovation. David is, of course, the founder of IDEO. IDEO was the combination of three companies: David Kelly Design, Matrix Design, and ID2. And those three companies got together in 1991 and formed IDEO. And then in 2005, we kicked off the D School here, which is our graduate institute of design thinking, teaching design thinking to all the graduate students on campus, regardless of what school they come from. So this notion of using the ways in which designers have been solving problems for years and years, particularly the kind of multidisciplinary design we do here at Stanford, got codified into this notion of design thinking and turned into a couple of different things. We've got both a process diagram. Went a little bit too fast for myself there. Process diagram. And sort of what we call the culture of creativity or the mindsets of creativity. In design thinking, many of you have probably seen this diagram before. We say we don't start with the problem, we start with people, we start with empathy. If we're trying to redesign, cell phones or headsets or, any kind of consumer product, and nowadays also any kind of consumer service or experience, we go out into the field and we observe people having the experience that we're trying to improve or redesign. We believe it's critical to actually observe people doing the behaviors that are surrounding the thing that we're working on, because without that information, we often find ourselves in a situation where we've got a solution in search of a user. We use that information from the empathy stage of design thinking to sort of redefine the problem. I often joke that in 30-some years of consulting to lots of different companies in the Valley, the clients never once come in with the right problem. And they almost often come in with a symptom or something that's too narrowly defined in order to create a new innovation. So the empathy and defined stage of the project is really making sure that we have a strong, what we call point of view, a user plus a need plus some insight about that need before we begin designing things. Then we ideate a lot, brainstorming, mind mapping, morphological analysis. We've got dozens of tools for coming up with exciting, a large number of exciting ideas, because we believe if you have a lot of ideas, you'll choose better ideas, and you won't get fixated on one or two things and try to push them into the marketplace. And then we use a very iterative process of ideation, prototyping, and testing. Ideate, prototype, test, and we keep doing that. Sometimes we might go back to redefine the problem when we realize our prototypes aren't really landing with customers. And sometimes we'll even go back, and actually the prototyping process is a way of further inquiring about the users and the needs and the market. So we often go from prototype back to empathy. So it's a pretty iterative process, and we can enter or exit this diagram at any place. We just put it in this order because that's the good way to describe it. But I don't want you to think of it as a step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, step 5 thing. It's really more of an iterative process, and we reconnect back to redefining our point of view almost every time we prototype. And that's you know, the mindsets of design thinking: bias to action, radical collaboration, mindfulness of process, curiosity, and then reframing. And we'll come back to this point of reframing when we talk a little bit about the comparison between lean and design thinking, because reframing is really kind of our word for pivot. But we believe that if you create a culture that is deeply curious, and most engineering cultures and many design cultures are kind of skeptical. They start with a point of view that things, you know, that try to dissect, analyze, and shoot down ideas versus being curious about new ideas. And if you have a bias to action, essentially recognizing that you have very little data about the future or your customers' behavior, so you might as well just start trying things rather than planning. If you do radical collaboration, which is, you know, bringing everyone on the team together, and it doesn't have to be a startup team, it can be a, you know, a very mature company, but bringing people together from, you know, from the field sales office to the marketing folks to the engineering team to maybe even service and the channel team, people who normally don't work together on projects are more in a linear flow. If we put them into a circular flow of radical collaboration, and we use the design thinking process, we're mindful of our process to sort of glue the team together so they all know what they're working on, we get this, we call it culture of creativity. We build people's creative confidence, and we find that these are the kinds of teams that after they've done a project or two are incredibly high performing and often come up with the really big innovations that people are looking for. So, you know, that's kind of the overview of design thinking. I want to point out one critical thing is we don't start with, hey, how do we find a market for a technology? And we don't start with presuming that the thing we can make is the thing people want, right? We start with what we call need finding. It's a process of getting beyond what people say and do to what they think and feel, because I want to make sure everybody understands, we don't think customers know what they want. Customers almost never know what they want. And if you ask them and survey them and focus group them, they will, you know, even if you get them to be a little bit generative and creative, they want something just like the thing they have, only better. I'd like my battery life to be longer in my cell phone. I'd like, you know, the screen to be brighter on my laptop. I'd like, you know, my oven to clean itself faster. But they never think about what could be a product that's completely disruptive to all of those behaviors. So like an iceberg, you know, the things that people say people say to you in a focus group or a survey are kind of the explicit needs. They're easily observable above the waterline. The things that are more interesting are the implicit needs below the waterline, and there's sort of two levels of that. Things that you can kind of observe by looking at how people work around problems or how they perceive the work that they're doing, and you can observe them doing the work and find out the gaps in sort of the use and usability of the things they're working with. But if you really want to get to the interesting stuff, you've got to get down to the meaning-making layer of this thing, the bottom of the pyramid, and that's where people will tell you stories. For instance, if you remember, if any of you are old enough to remember your old flip phone before you got a smartphone, and then you were on your flip phone and you were talking to somebody and you said, hey, what's Susan's number? And you say, yeah, I've got her in my contact list here, but I'm probably going to end up hanging up on you because I never can remember how to find it, but just a second, and then you'd move through the modes of your flip phone interface, and you would inevitably hang up on the person, and then you'd maybe not even be able to find Susan's number, and that's one story. But if you actually talk to people about it and you say, how did that make you feel? They'd say, it made me feel stupid. It made me feel embarrassed in front of my friend. I've had this phone for a year, and I've never liked it because because people assume the technology is good, and they're the problem. And once you heard that story, and the embedded meaning in that story, it became obvious to any a human-centered designer that there's a huge opportunity to make a difference. I was 7 years at Apple, long before they were designing phones, mostly through the 90s, but we were designing the first laptops. Apple always had the point of view that we were going to make computers for everybody else, not for the cognoscenti, not for the technically savvy, but for anybody, so that a first-grade teacher could put Macs in her classroom and make it work and network them and get the kids on it and have it not crash. I would argue that in the early days of Macintosh and Apple, the whole mantra was don't make people feel stupid, make them feel powerful, make them feel smart, make them feel like the computer's just a tool that they're using to get the thing they want to get done. And that was hugely successful. So this need-finding thing I'll come back to when we talk about the lean process. So design thinking, it's a dynamic approach to problem solving. It's very nonlinear. It works really well when you have these poorly bounded problems, and particularly problems with people in them where they change their mind all the time about what they want. And even if you design what they want and then you show it to them and they say, oh, I changed my mind. I don't want that anymore. I want something else. It just acknowledges that that's the way things go, that prototyping and iteration are the rapid learning and improvement process. It's a good approach really to problem finding. We often, again, discover even really good design teams that are tightly coupled with their markets and understand their users well will create a product or an idea that really doesn't actually solve any problem that anybody has. And so we find that this sort of, need finding, redefining the problem, coming up with a point of view, testing that point of view with some very quick prototypes, and then going back to see, did we have the right problem in the first place, is really the most powerful part of this. And it creates value across the food chain. It creates value in this co-creation process. And it gets you your early adopter users, and it gets you, pretty high value impact for pretty low investment. Okay. So that's design thinking. Now, the Lean Startup is Eric Ries's book and a bunch of other stuff that's come out has been a huge impact, I think, in the startup culture here in Silicon Valley, and a very, very positive one. And when we scheduled this webinar, I hadn't actually looked yet, but that turns out there's a Lean Startup conference going on in San Francisco, today. And I think it's the last day of the conference. So that's fantastic. A lot of people in town studying how to apply this really powerful process to creating value in new enterprises. Now, interestingly enough, in his book, Ries says a startup is really any human institution designed to create a new product or service under extreme uncertainty. So, broadly speaking, this isn't necessarily applied only to the archetypal, quintessential, 5 folks in a garage trying to change the world, or, 2 technologists in a lab somewhere who come up with a great new technology. He'd argue this could be inside any size company. The key elements are that you're trying to create some kind of an economic entity, some institution that is going to operate in an extreme uncertain environment, and therefore the traditional ways of managing with milestones and timelines and checkpoints and forecasts really don't make much sense because the uncertainty is so high that those things are based on such faulty and flimsy data that they don't measure the important things about the enterprise. And the goal is to eliminate waste and increase value and produce practices around this that can be followed, that can be learned and followed. And a lot of this stuff came from the lean manufacturing things that were developed at Toyota and ideas of, small lot sizes and continuous improvement and being able to stop the production line when you were building faulty product. And then heavily influenced also by Steve Blank's this customer development idea, customer development model. A lot of which are, have many, many similarities with what we talk about when we talk about design thinking. So the 5 principles, you guys probably all know this. The entrepreneurs are everywhere. Entrepreneurship is, in fact, a management technique. It's not just a cult of personality. That validated learning is the way you move a startup forward, that there's a build, measure, learn cycle, very much like the ideate, prototype, test cycle, and that you have to account for things in a lean startup differently than you account for them in a traditional company because of the high uncertainty that you're dealing with when you're trying to innovate in a very radical or disruptive way. Then, the big ideas that people toss around the valley, and I hear these words used, almost all every day now, one way or another, even with people who I think know nothing about the lean method. In the same way I hear people saying design thinking and brainstorming and, using those terms so much generically. But I think it's important in both cases to really understand the model because at one level, all of these models are pretty simple. They're just, a bunch of definitions and they fit together in a nice framework. But I think there's some really subtle stuff going on in both cases. So the one big idea is the minimum viable product. It's some version of a product that allows the team to collect a bunch of validated learning about customers with the least amount of development, design, investment, and effort. So remembering, that a lot of this was based around Reese's experience in a software startup, or multiple software startups, and that this is often applied to software. The minimum viable product in this case is, maybe a buggy piece of code, but something that will deliver at least, do you have a hypothesis that the customer wants a certain set of features or a certain utility? You build only the minimum amount to deliver that utility, and then you test it with customers, particularly customers, early adopters who are willing to buy the technology. So they've made a commitment to the idea, and you test it to discover, is it valid? Is it useful? Is that your assumption or your value proposition, your hypothesis, is what they talk about a lot in the book. Is your hypothesis valid, and will more and more customers, want to buy the product, even when it's at this very minimal and potentially even buggy state? I'll talk a little bit later about how this applies to something that's not a software startup. Then the other big idea is the build, measure, learn. You turn ideas into products, you measure how the customers respond, and you learn whether to persevere or to pivot. And this is sort of a critical learning cycle in the lean methodology, and it makes a ton of sense, right? If you're going to start with the entrepreneur's vision and some technology, and then you're going to try to find what they call a market fit, you would want to build as little as possible to preserve both your resources, cash, time, people, get it into the marketplace, measure how the customers respond, and from that response, figure out whether you want to keep building out that product or whether something has come up in the customer information that would cause you to change your direction. The other, other big ideas are actionable metrics versus what he calls vanity metrics. I love that phrase. Vanity metrics are, looking at, what's our, how many milestones did we hit? What's our progress towards completion? Things like number of features in the product would be the internal vanity metrics that don't really make much sense in a startup. But the other ones are, people have these market projections. They have a hypothesis that the product is useful, and they project how many people would want the useful product, and then they track themselves against that metric, which doesn't make much sense since it's unlikely that the product, that the original hypothesis is correct. He has, I'm not going to go into all of the ways in which you can create actionable metrics, because they really changes depending on what your business model is, or the business engine, as he calls it. But the basic idea is you start with your minimum viable product, you get some baseline data, you have an ideal that you're shooting for in your business plan. You need X amount of revenue and such. That ideal is also measured against the amount of money that you've raised, so you have a certain runway, you have a burn rate, whatever that is. You try to keep that as small as possible by building minimum viable products. Then you try to keep moving that baseline towards your ideal. And a lot of startups talk about what's my runway, which is essentially, I've got $1 million, I'm spending $100,000 a month. That means I have a 10-month runway. In Lean, you look at it a little bit differently, and you say, how many pivots do I have between now and when I run out of money? Because the theory is I'll just keep pivoting around various different aspects of my business until I find that market fit, and we start accelerating and we build revenue, and then we change the model from a investment model to a growth model. His suggestion is you pick the riskiest assumption first, whatever you're assuming the customer wants, and you test that. And a good design, and this is a kind of an interesting thing, there's an emphasis throughout the Lean Startup book on this method being scientific. I think some of my science colleagues here at Stanford would argue it's not exactly scientific method, because it's almost impossible to run a control, and because the variations of systems like this are multivariable. But in any case, I'd say it's a much more measurable method than others. And one of the debates that it seeks to end is this sort of artificial debate over, I know what good design is, and I know what the customers should want, and I'm either a designer or an interaction person, or I'm the founder, and I know my idea is a great idea. And it sort of negates that conflict and conversation by saying, actually the good design is just the one that changes the customer's behavior towards the ideal. We have an ideal sort of business objective, typically in revenue and profitability, and we're trying to customer acquisition or velocity into the market or first mover advantage, whatever our ideal is, or whatever we're shooting for. Good design is simply the thing that moves us towards that. So that gets us out of the issue of opinion and aesthetics and all the other things that come up when people start arguing around design. And again, I think that's critical in this method, because it's about being efficient and making good choices quickly, and having enough pivots in time to validate the idea and accelerate towards revenue in a startup, or even in a divisional, inside a division, to have success in growing either revenue or market share quickly before either the investors, venture capitalists in most cases, or in the case of an internal team, the CEO team or upper management team or strategic planning team, who has allocated a certain amount of resources, dollars and people, to a project, and are going to pull the plug on that project if it doesn't meet its overall ideal objectives. So let's see. So one of the thing I also hear people talking about all the time is we're going to pivot. We're going to pivot. And I think the this is actually a pretty interesting, idea, and I think a lot like our prototype test, probably easily misunderstood. In design thinking, a prototype isn't a version of the final product. A prototype is the thing you use to ask a question of the market. And it's typically much less than a full-blown product. You might just be asking a question about, how does the customer acquire information about this, or how does the customer use a certain feature. I think in the lean startup is similarly, you have the minimum viable product, you have a strategic hypothesis that you think is testable. Customers will share this app with their friends or invite friends to this, application, and then the application will go viral. And if that's your strategic hypothesis, you test that with a project or with a minimum viable product, and it turns out that's not true, that people will not share their friends' information with the current version of the product, and then you try to figure out why. Then you have a new hypothesis. Well, they're not sharing because it's not a large enough network, there's no network effect, or they're not sharing because they don't believe the product's useful enough, or they're not sharing because it looks like they're spamming their friends. So whatever your hypothesis is, you then build another. You pivot around that hypothesis and say, okay, if sharing's not going to work, we'll try this other methodology, and you test the next version of a minimum viable product. So it's a pretty specific idea that the pivot is moving the original hypothesis. This is what our company does, and this is what we make this valuable. Moving it into a different hypothesis that is testable. It's not changing. It's not saying, well, we started necessarily saying, well, we started out thinking we'll be, another social network like Facebook, but we'll just be it for cat owners. And then that doesn't work, and then you decide, oh, well, let's do an e-commerce site that sells jewelry. That's not a pivot. That's just a crash and burn and, starting a new company. So what I like about this is that Reese defines, and others have even expanded this, that there are a bunch of different pivots. It's not just, the product itself. It might be, that you're just looking at the wrong customer segment. You need a different platform. You're building it on the wrong platform. That you thought your engine of growth was going to be, viral marketing, but it turns out it's sort of a freemium model or something. That you're in the wrong channel, or that you're using the technology, incorrect technologies, business architectures, on and on. So these are very strategic and very specific ways in which you might pivot, which bring in the rest of the business canvas. There's also some stuff about business canvas in this model lately, but we don't need to go into that. But it brings in things like, well, how do customers find out about me? What's the channel for distributing the product to the customer? What's the platform, that I'm using, so I don't have to build my own cloud, or I don't have to build my own e-commerce engine. So there's a lot of different ways in which you can look at this pivot that they're really well defined and really helpful, I think, in sort of diagnosing where's the problem in my overall startup business model. That's a great set of actionable ideas. There are many other ways in which you might pivot, but I think those really cover things that are important. There's lots of other ideas, and people have been developing the notion of lean in quite a few different ways. Things like small batch size, which comes right out of the manufacturing world. Don't build. There's an example in the book of stuffing 1,000 envelopes, doing it in sequence, or doing it all in sizes of one, and it's more efficient. This notion of continuous deployment, which really kind of only works in the software world, as does A/B or split testing, and some other ideas. Now would be a good place to sort of talk about where lean has been applied to hardware companies. I'm sort of a hardware person. I'm very much a hardware person. My degrees are in mechanical engineering, essentially, and spent my time, startups in Apple building the early PowerBook computers and physical products. There's a bunch of challenges that come up in the physical product world and hardware land that are not the same. They're really quite different and a bit more challenging than what happens in software development. Software development, essentially, once you've completed the software and tested it, it can be instantaneously deployed, to everyone who wants it. Whereas physical products, even after you've prototyped and developed a product that you think can be very successful, there's quite a bit of a ramp before you have a product that you can sell, and then it's not scalable instantaneously because it's physical. It has to be moved around the world. Only extremely large and sophisticated companies like Apple, IBM, and Amazon probably can take a new product and simultaneously distribute it in channels all over the world. I read a piece of data a couple of days ago. Apple shipped 87 million iPhones in the last quarter. So let's just round it up to 90 for the sake of easy division. 90 days, 90 million iPhones. That's a million iPhones a day. The logistical challenges of doing anything at that scale really do bring another level of complexity to the lean model. Now, there's a bunch of resources out there on this that are pretty good. If you go lean startup and hardware, there's a couple of incubators that are writing about how to do this. There's a lean startup startup.io hardware group. There's a bunch of other pretty good resources, and the main thing that comes up is that it's much more difficult to iterate minimum viable products in the physical space. You can do lots and lots of fast and easy soft prototyping, which is what we talk about in design thinking a lot, but it's very difficult to build fully functional products and then iterate them quickly. The iteration cycle on physical products is months, not days, and that has a tendency to work against this fast learning. And so I think if you were to take a lean approach specifically to hardware, you would really have to change a couple of the underlying assumptions, and that's where I want to walk us through now. So if you look at the two models, this is the interesting part. You look at the two models; they're very, very similar. They really work in similar ways. They work kind of on different domains, and that was the hard thing for me to get my brain around at first. Like, how do you compare these things? It's a little bit apples and oranges. But the things that are underlying assumptions that are absolutely the same is both assume extreme uncertainty, that you're doing something for which there is no data that will tell you what to do. So, for instance, let's distinguish between, when I was at Apple, I did 11 PowerBook computers. But, we had two kinds of products. We had products that were radically different, and we had products that we called speed bumps. You take last year's, MacBook nowadays, and you throw in a bigger solid-state drive, retina screen, and a faster processor. And you say, that's the new MacBook. And that is. It's new. It's different. It has more of the same things that the old MacBook has. So that's what we call a speed bump. You don't need lean or design thinking for that. That's a regular process because the market wants it. It's not uncertain. Everybody wants a faster processor and better screen. So that's not a project that has high uncertainty. But I just got my new iPad Pro with a keyboard and stylus. That is a completely new thing, at least for Apple. I think there's some, obviously the Surface, Microsoft Surface is already in that space. But in terms of what Apple had to do to sort of innovate around a new pointing technology and everything else, there is a little bit of a leap into the unknown for them because they have no idea whether this is going to work or not, or whether people are going to stop buying notebooks and start buying iPad Pros. And even, had you been a startup that was trying to invent the next generation of tablet computing, you really don't, there's really no way to know whether people are going to want to, type on a keyboard or type on a screen or write with a stylus and what kind of stylus. So if you're in the domain of problems that are really difficult and really, and you cannot get accurate data about the user's behavior until you actually build something, you're in the same, both methods are applicable, in fact, designed for those kinds of situations. By the way, both assume that the users don't know what they want and they can't tell you what to make. They can't tell you what to make, at least directly. There's a misunderstanding that, in design thinking, since we start with need finding, we're expecting the customer to just give us the product and then we execute it. The customers, as I said, don't know anything. There's an old famous quote attributed to Henry Ford that evidently he never said, but it sounds like something Henry Ford would have said. He said, if I'd asked people what they wanted, they would have told me they wanted faster horses. And that would never get you to the Model T, right? Whether he said it or not, it's the same thing. Customers can't tell you what they want, so you have to be the inventor, the designer, the creator. But if you base it on observations of customer behavior, like that behavior of feeling stupid, you can create a really, really sort of magical innovations. And both assume that rapid cycles of building and learning is the only process that gets you actionable data. You got to build something and you got to try it with people, otherwise you don't know what you want, because that's how you sort of move yourself into this future that is going to exist when you really nail the final product and you have a really good market fit. People can't tell you that they want something until they see it. No one could have told you that they wanted an iPhone until they saw it. As you remember in the biographies of Steve Jobs, that he turned the iPhone down 3 or 4 times and said it wasn't good enough. So, this notion that the only thing that gets you information about when you're done or when you have a market fit is to build and learn. We say, to D-School, we say we build to think. That's how you move the bar forward. And the Lean Startup is really quite different structurally than design thinking. So although they both work on ambiguous problems that are difficult to solve, and they both use a sort of iterative prototyping and testing methodology to move forward and get data, Lean Startup is described as a management blueprint for entrepreneurs, that entrepreneurship is a form of management, and this is the blueprint for that form of managing. It emphasizes managing and measuring the processes that are unique in these high uncertainty environments. That he calls startups, so they could be entrepreneurship in big companies, pure startups that are starting up on their own. And it emphasizes testing and learning, and it has these metrics that allow you to measure whether you're making progress towards your ideal business plan. So it really is a very highly structured and really quite nicely done sort of blueprint for an entrepreneurial team to follow that will give them a much higher chance of being successful, particularly in the software world where they can iterate quickly. Design thinking is not actually, was never ever conceived around this notion of managing. And so, it's around creating the right culture for innovation. It's a methodology where David Kelly talks about having to innovate regularly. A lot of what design thinking comes from is the work we've done here at Stanford, the people I mentioned, Bob McKim and Rolf Fosse. But also the work that David's done, in the world of IDEO, where they're constantly facing completely unique challenges from really interesting clients from all over the world. And of course, when you hire an innovation firm like IDEO, you expect innovation. It's not okay to this time we didn't get any. So they had to evolve a method to innovate all the time, regularly on every project. Its emphasis is mostly on, on this idea of empathy for users, this notion of collaboration, that teams, that the teams of different people, when collaborating together, will come up with the unique ideas because of their diversity, and this bias to action. And it also emphasizes a testing and learning cycle, prototype test, but it's quite different in that it doesn't have a blueprint for how you would manage a company. You could manage a company in a number of different ways and still employ design thinking to create your culture. So where I think the things, so I think the interesting things are that the lean startup is based on a fundamental assumption. This is off of Steve Blank's own blog. He says, most startups, and certainly the startups that he was building the ideas around, he and Eric Ries, the startups are technology driven, and they're founded by visionaries who have an idea, and they're just looking for a market fit. Startups, and they have to find that market fit before they run out of money. So this notion of pivoting and testing and pivoting and measuring is critical. And Steve noted that design thinking doesn't start with the founder's vision or a product in hand. It's just not. It's a completely different philosophy. So once you have the assumption that this is all based on the notion that some entrepreneurial duo or team thinks they've got an idea, they start with their idea. They start with a piece of technology and an idea, and then they go looking for the market fit. You can sort of, once you've grokked that, then you understand that's completely different from the assumption that's underlying design thinking. The key difference is this idea of a technology push, engineering-centric startup is very problematic to us, because it has too much reliance on the vision of the technologist or the founder or the pair of founders, and not enough emphasis on need finding. Design thinking looks for the need market fit first, in lean language, market fit first, and then selects the appropriate implementation technologies. I looked up a couple of stats that I think were kind of interesting based on this observation. So again, draw a clear difference. In lean, you start with your founder's idea and you look for the market fit, and you pivot until you find it, and then you're successful. And in design thinking, you start with empathy, not the solution, and then you find, you prototype your way into solutions, and then you test and build those in the same way as lean. So there's not a lot of great statistics on this, but looking through Forbes and a couple other places, almost everybody agrees that 8 or 9 out of 10 startups fail. So it's about a 90% failure rate. And in fact, if you really look if you look a little deeper than that, it's a much higher failure rate, because a lot of startups that never get, sort of registered, never get to the state of an A round or a B round, and then fail. Who raise a little bit of friends and family money and then just, can't find investors, can't move forward. I would argue it's probably at least twice that rate. But even whether it's 90% failure or 95% failure, it's kind of odd that we have such excitement and such enthusiasm in the Valley for something that hardly ever works. And CB Insights, which is a group that follows VCs and startups and stuff and does research, took a look at 101 postmortems that founders had written about their startup. And the number one reason, 42%, the highest percentage of reasons for failure, by self-reporting by entrepreneurs themselves who'd written up a case study on why they thought their company failed. 42% said it was because there was no market need for the product. And if you actually double-click on that research, 29% of the reasons they failed was they ran out of cash, which is the same thing as we couldn't find a market need for our product. And poor product was 17%, and didn't have a business model, 17%, and poor marketing was 14% of the reasons respondents said things worked. But all of those are, you didn't have an idea. You had a technology that nobody wanted. You can't market yourself into success if nobody wants to. If you don't provide some fundamental value, you're not going to be successful in the marketplace. And so, what's curious to me is that this underlying assumption that we have visionaries roaming around Silicon Valley or New York or Austin or Boston or anywhere, where there's a lot of entrepreneurship going on, and that somehow we have to start with a visionary's idea and then figure out, where we can fit it, versus starting with a much more fundamental premise that you don't know what's going to be successful. You have a point of view, we'll call it, and that's what we call it in design thinking, but you're more than willing to change that point of view as soon as you get data on your underlying assumption. And that comes from the same kind of an inquiry in the marketplace with prototyping, but a point of view is always a user plus a need plus the insight that you've got about that combination that gives you the unfair advantage or the nonlinear, insight. And that insight came from customer observation. It's not what customers said they wanted. It's what you believe is you saw them wanting faster horses, but you're going to design the Model T, and then it's going to work. And so, the biggest critique I would have of the two systems is this sort of false assumption that the entrepreneur is anywhere near a good idea. Now, when you look at design thinking, I think the critique is often, it doesn't provide a blueprint at all for managing startups. It doesn't tell you how to manage things. Doesn't tell you how to organize things. It's silent on all of that, and I think that's a big issue. I think it's why I'm starting to see instances where people say, well, we tried design thinking, but it didn't work. And one, I'm not sure the implementation was very good. And two, design thinking by itself does not organize the activities of a startup. And design thinking is pretty short on actionable metrics at this point, and we're working on that. I think that's critical. To simply say, we tried a bunch of things and here's what customers said doesn't necessarily have that kind of direct connection back to the business model, and that direct connection back to trying to hit some sort of ideal metrics that that Lean Startup has. And design thinking doesn't directly address any of the downstream issues. It's primarily around the innovation, finding the blue ocean, white space, whatever you want to call it, creating prototypes and models into that space that hit that resonant chord. This is what people are really willing to buy. But in terms of segmentation, platform, business strategies, channel strategies and stuff, design thinking is silent. And I think there's probably more to gain from looking towards Lean at that point to continue to build a viable organization. And let's see. So my conclusion, they both have a lot in common, particularly the class of problems they work on. Lean Startup would benefit from outing this idea that technology visionaries come first, and of trying to apply a little more rigor at the front end of the process before you start building minimum viable products, that you find out a little bit more about whether or not there is a need. Start with a need first. And d.thinking would obviously benefit from having a better blueprint and actionable metrics that come out of the Lean process. My sense is that these two things are so wonderfully compatible that a combination of the two would be pretty powerful. And we certainly see that people are using both, and it's a yes and rather than an or kind of a situation. I want to leave you with the last thing, and then we'll give it back to Matt, and then we'll see if we can answer some questions for you. There's a famous Peter Drucker quote. I think he actually said culture eats process for breakfast, but the two last presidents, CEOs of Ford Motor Company, Mark Fields and Alan Mulally, have used the same thing. I think regardless of your process, you have to establish the right kind of culture, because culture is what's going to sustain a startup through rough times, through good times and bad. If you look at what the top 20 reasons why startups fail, based on this CB Insights analysis of 101 postmortems of startups, not the right team, 23% of the time, ignored customers, lost focus, these are like 10, 12%, lack of passion, and burnout are other reasons why, people who were running startups that crashed felt they had failed. And all of those are culture issues. It's not about the perfect team, it's about the team you can make perfect. You make a team high performance by building a culture that accepts failure, that supports learning and growth, and that has the authenticity and honesty to answer these questions that come up when you do these pivot tests. And it's really hard when you're an entrepreneur and you've got an idea and you think it's great and no one in the marketplace likes it at all. It's a human characteristic to try to preserve our ideas, to fall in love with the things we make, and to I've heard any number of engineers and startup entrepreneurs say, well, the customers are just stupid, or the customers don't get it. And it's hard to be in a startup. It's hard to fail. But I think if you apply the right kind of culture, and you can get there through lean or through design thinking, that's the only thing I know that I think changes the possibility of success. Let's see. One is it's clear to understand how design thinking would benefit. There's tactile designs, but product designs maybe. Is it similarly true that it could benefit non-customer-facing designs, such as boring back-office stuff or business processes? And the answer is yeah. In fact, that's where a lot of interesting work is going on now with some companies where either my students are or companies that are working with us. Any business transaction or any back-office process, of just getting, how do we get POs done faster? How do we get expenses? How do we get our employees' expense reports done faster? If you take a human-centered approach to this, the possibility of coming up with an idea that's really, really, sort of sticky is interesting. And I think all processes really boil down to one human exchanging something, information or something with another human. And so if you can understand where the pain points are, where the sticking points are, where the behaviors are negative, you can do a lot of really good work with back-end processes. Let's see, there was, why would, in my lecture I said you pick the riskiest assumption first, and could you give an example? That actually comes straight out of the Lean Startup book, and I think the example he uses is they had this app, and they thought that, and they had avatars. There was an IM system with avatars, and they thought that people would recommend that the way they were going to, the engine of growth for this thing was a viral sort of marketing. I was going to try this, and then I was going to send, avatars to my friends, and in order for them to get them, they would have to, log in as well, and that the whole thing was really going to be a social media phenomenon. And so that was if that didn't work, that would be the riskiest assumption. If that didn't work, then there was no reason to build out the rest of the platform. And they tested it, and it didn't work. And so, he points that out as there's often something, and it takes a little bit of time to sort of out your riskiest assumption, or out the assumptions you're making about your customer and what their needs are. And so I think this is critical to have the courage to pick, well, what's the thing that our whole business plan revolves around? And to test that as early and as quickly as possible. Because if it turns out that's not true, then the whole thing doesn't work. I'll give you an example of mine from Apple. This was back in the 90s when Apple introduced the Newton. If you remember, for those of you who would remember the Newton, it was this virtual personal assistant. It could do everything, including handwriting recognition, and it was going to make your life easy. And it didn't work. And Apple spent a lot of money trying to figure out, why it didn't work. But no one questioned the fundamental assumption that people did not want a personal digital assistant, or at least one that had those capabilities. I mean, think about Siri today. It's barely able to be, what Apple was trying to promise in the 90s. And some people who were really smart introduced the Palm Pilot, which is radically successful and fantastic, because they said, you know what, people don't actually want that. That's all they want is somebody who will just manage their calendar and their contact list for them. And so the Palm became really the basis of what everything is in every smartphone now. But Apple never tested their fundamental assumption that people wanted a personal assistant. There was a question like, does it sound sort of like maybe design thinking is about building the right prototype, and lean is about taking that forward? That's probably a little simplistic, but it's not a bad way of thinking about it. I think if entrepreneurs, before they go out and raise money and make promises, actually knew that they were addressing a serious human need or a serious need in the marketplace. It could simply be, it could be a B2B need. It doesn't have to be a personal need. There's a famous deck that goes around Silicon Valley. I think it came out of the Moore Davidow venture firm, but I'm not sure. But it talks about business plans, and they say there's two kinds of business plans: vitamins and antibiotics. Vitamins we don't invest in because everybody knows you're supposed to take your vitamin, but it's not. It's just an aspiration. It's not a real need. But boy, if you have an infection or you're in pain, so it was the vitamins and antibiotics and painkillers. We invest in painkillers and antibiotics because when you need them, you really need them, and you will pay lots and lots to get them. I think that's what this whole front end of the design process is all about: is finding the thing that really relieves the pain point, and it has to be significant. It has to be important. There's a lot of people writing that the Valley's not working on hard things anymore. There's internet-connected cat litter boxes and things like that, which I think does indicate we might be in a little bit of a bubble. But I think if you imagined bolting design thinking and lean together, because you're always going to need innovation. You're always going to, even when you get to the manufacturing step in hardware, you're going to need innovation. You're going to need, innovative supply chains, innovative relationships with your vendors. Design thinking can help open up those spaces and give you new ideas. How do you define ideal behavior and measure change in customer behavior? Well, it really depends on the business plan. If your business plan depended on customer recommendations in order to have a low enough cost of customer acquisition to make your fundamental model profitable, then I would say ideal behavior is customer recommendations. They're telling 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 of their friends, hey, get on this app so I can send you my cool emoji or my fun, whatever. If in a B2B situation, where it's a much longer selling cycle and it's not just to download something and try it, then it would be, the behavior of running, test markets. I think, when IBM and Oracle and those guys started, let's say in the database business, nobody was willing to just throw away an entire legacy system and, install Oracle. They would have to, do a small test. So your ideal behavior would be how many customer engagements are we having that turn into, a customer test. So really, I think, and it's pretty well sort of segmented in the Lean Startup book. How do you determine what kind of ideal behaviors you want? Because it's not just downloads, it's not just eyeballs. I think it really depends on the business you're trying to build and where the revenue in that business will come from to define ideal behavior. Okay, so the last one, from a learning perspective, how do you bring organizations up to speed on design thinking and lean, or both? Well, right now there's a huge conference going on in the city on the Lean Startup, which is a great way to not only learn, there's workshops to learn the technique and to learn the basic ideas and the processes, and then there's lots and lots of case studies and speakers talking about their experience of implementation. So I think there's no shortage of information and opportunities to get educated. We run, the master class coming up. I'd love to see you guys join us if you can on design thinking, and we also run, other boot camps throughout the year. So if you go to the D-School website, you'll see a whole bunch on executive education. I think that diffusing these ideas into big organizations is always a challenge, and that's kind of the subject of another talk, I think, at another time. But there's plenty of there's lots and lots of stuff now in the literature. Harvard Business Review just had a whole cover on design thinking and its use in strategy and in operations. So the information is available, and I think you start with just educating a team, trying a small project, and kind of seeing how things fit and graft into your own organization. Every culture is different, and as I say, culture, each process for lunch. If you don't have, if you can't, you got to approach the culture change very slowly and very carefully, if you want to have some early successes. So I think we're out of time.
Yep. Thank you again, Bill, for coming today and sharing all this great information with everyone. And I'd like to thank you all for joining. And with that, we'll catch you next time. Thanks a lot. Bye.